Welcome and thanks for joining us for today's HIS Talk webinar. I think you're going to be in for a real treat today since I suspect this webinar will be more fun than what you're used to. It's titled Share the Road, Driving EHR Contracts to Good Compromises, and it's brought to you by HIS Talk. I'm Lori from HIS Talk and I'll be moderating. Attendee phone lines have been muted to prevent background noise. You can use GoToWebinar's question box in the console to submit questions to our presenter at any time. The presenter will answer your questions during Q&A at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive links to the recording as well as to the PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. Our speaker today is Steve Blumenthal. Steve is a business and corporate law attorney with McAllester, Norton, PLLC of Nashville, Tennessee. His practice includes traditional commercial transactional work and innovative internet technology and data privacy work. Steve readily admits that he isn't the coolest guy in town. He's a sci-fi geek, a movie nerd, and a Prius-driving techie. But he's also a hard-working, no-nonsense lawyer who loves negotiating for his clients with a business-first approach. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Lori, for the introduction. I do want to be clear, though, that this webinar won't be fun at all. Just to make sure, you had indicated that would be fun. I don't do fun. An EHR is not a car. And that may sound obvious, but the car metaphor seems to have a reserved parking space in our minds when we negotiate EHR contracts. A doctor recently told me, for example, that an EHR vendor's contract terms were equivalent to buying 4 wheels, an engine, and a frame, but with no guarantee that those pieces would work together as a car. While the car metaphor has its shortcomings, I think it's a useful tool for discussing key issues in EHR contracts. So, buckle your seatbelts. We're going to talk about EHR contracts. But before we do, let me just say that for those of you who haven't seen my promo video for this webinar, the monster on this page that you're seeing is the 1972 Buick LeSabre that I drove in high school. This isn't actually my car. Mine looked worse than this one, especially after I smacked it against one side of our garage. But you know, driving the Buick wasn't all bad. No, I take that back. It was all bad. So let's talk about contracts in general and my goal for today's presentation. Contracts are used primarily as tools for structuring relationships. They are intended to document what the parties have agreed to do for and with each other. A useful approach to thinking about a contract is to identify the primary purpose of the relationship and then determine how to allocate responsibility for accomplishing that purpose between the contracting parties. In the typical software license, the primary purpose of the relationship is to enable the licensee to use the licensor's software in exchange for the payment of a fee. Simple, right? Well, not so much. There are many responsibilities that need to be allocated between the licensor and the licensee, and in most cases there isn't a clear, simple answer as to how to allocate them. For example, who should be responsible for making sure that the software works the way the licensee expects? What if the licensee's expectations aren't consistent with the software specs? On the other hand, what if the licensee is a doctor with a full schedule of patients and not nearly enough time to read and digest software specs? I think that informed negotiated compromise is the best way to achieve a good allocation of responsibilities. For example, the licensor should bear responsibility for ensuring that the software works as described in the documentation provided by the licensor, while the licensee should bear responsibility for any expectations beyond that. I want to be clear that I'm not in favor of splitting the, car in half, although this guy here seems to have done just that. Informed negotiated compromises don't necessarily result in the parties bearing equal burdens. But if the parties engage in an informed negotiation, they should end up sharing responsibility in a manner best suited to accomplish the purposes of their relationship. I want to point out I got a double pun in here on this page. You see the car keys reference both getting started and key responsibilities. And yes, I'm going to point out those sorts of goofy things throughout this webinar, much to my wife's irritation. That's just the kind of guy I am. Moving on. In today's presentation, I will discuss the following key responsibilities. See, I said it again, key. That need to be allocated between the parties to an EHR contract: interoperability, system performance, training, data privacy and security, and protection from intellectual property infringement. With respect to each of those responsibilities, I will discuss remedies that an EHR contract could provide to a party in the event that the other party fails to meet its assigned responsibilities, including indemnification, warranties, damages, and termination. The goal of this presentation isn't to give you a cheat sheet to EHR contract negotiations. Given the varied and complex offerings of EHR systems today and different needs of different types and sizes of healthcare providers, I think the cheat sheet would take more time to read and digest than an EHR contract. Instead, my goal is to help you understand the concerns of vendors and customers that underlie key provisions in EHR contracts, so that when you negotiate your next EHR contract, you can cut through the thicket of legalese and quickly reach a reasonable and informed compromise. All right, let's talk about one of the toughest issues to deal with in EHR contracts: interoperability. When that doctor said to me that an EHR vendor's contract terms were equivalent to buying 4 wheels, an engine, and a frame, but with no guarantee about those pieces working together as a car, the issue he was concerned about was actually not whether the components of the EHR would work together, but whether the EHR would work with his other healthcare information technology systems. In other words, he wanted the EHR vendor, in that case my client, to give an interoperability warranty. Well, I responded that yes, Ford represents the 4 wheels, engine, and frame will work together as a Ford Fiesta, but Ford's warranty only covers that car. Ford doesn't warrant the interoperability of that 2,500-pound Fiesta with the 70,000-pound cement, or as they say here in Nashville, cement truck tailgating it on the highway. The front bumper of that monster cement truck is a steel bar 28 inches off the ground. That's half the height of the Fiesta, whose little bumper is only 16 inches off the ground. The tires of the cement truck are nearly as tall as the Fiesta. If the Fiesta were to stop suddenly, or as apparently happened in this photo, the cement truck rolls over on its side for no reason, which, by the way, is frightening, the cement truck would crush it like a Coke can. And yes, as incompatible as the Fiesta and the cement truck are, both vehicles comply with applicable federal and state regulations. Now, like the incompatible vehicles traveling our highways, incompatible systems operate on the healthcare information superhighway. Yes, healthcare information technology has standards. For nearly 30 years, Health Level 7 International, which a lot of you probably know as HL7, has developed and updated standards for sharing electronic health information. But HL7 hasn't turned healthcare information technology into a plug-and-play world. One of the reasons for HL7's widespread adoption is its flexibility. There is no single right way to implement HL7, and each HL7 implementation contains its own unique variations in coding, workflows, and other elements. I liken HL7's role in the interoperability of health information systems to the role of the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, otherwise known as AASHTO. And yes, that's really what it's called, AASHTO. You know I'm going to mess that up, and the nice folks at his talk are going to get fined by the FCC. AASHTO, I'm going to say it slowly, sets construction standards for interstate highways. Its standards cover everything from lane width, minimum design speeds, and the design of on and off ramps for interstate highways. But AASHTO doesn't regulate the vehicles that travel on interstate highways except indirectly by limiting the size of vehicles to fit within interstate lane width. Even when you factor in the regulatory role of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, auto manufacturers have a lot of room for customization of vehicles. Number of wheels, horsepower, weight, shape, color, they're all within the discretion of manufacturers. You're probably looking at the cat photo there. I killed some brain cells trying to think of an appropriate car photo for this page, but I wasn't successful except in killing some brain cells. So I included this cute cat picture I found on Google instead. So what does this mean? And I don't mean the cat, for EHR vendors. In short, an EHR vendor can't ensure interoperability between an EHR vendor system and third-party systems used by a healthcare provider. The EHR vendor can create an interface between its EHR system and a healthcare provider's lab system, for example, using the lab system vendor's published application programming interface. And if both the EHR and the lab system follow HL7 standards, that'll make it easier to create the interface. But even two HL7-based systems may not understand each other, and data may not flow correctly between them. Additionally, while the interface may work perfectly on day one, the lab system vendor could make a change to its system on day two that causes the interface to fail its entirety, or more likely causes certain messages to fall through the cracks. And the lab system vendor has no obligation to keep the EHR vendor in the loop on changes that the lab system vendor makes. On the other hand, if I'm a healthcare provider, my billing, scheduling, lab, and the EHR systems have to work together. Incompatibility means wasted money and time. It means increased administrative work, greater likelihood of transcription errors, all caused by repetitive data entry in multiple systems. And most of all, most healthcare providers are dependent upon their technology vendors to make the systems talk to each other. So if I'm a doctor, I expect someone to be on the hook for making all this technology work together, and that person won't be me. How can you reach an appropriate compromise to best achieve interoperability? Start by sharing information. A prospective EHR system customer should identify for the EHR vendor the other systems that the prospective customer uses or intends to use. The EHR vendor should tell the prospective customer whether the EHR vendor currently has interfaces between its EHR system and each of the systems identified by the prospective customer. If the EHR vendor has a good working relationship and a good track record with another system vendor, that'll increase the odds that the systems will work together and should also reduce the costs and efforts in getting an interface between the systems in place. If the EHR vendor doesn't have any past experience integrating with a particular system, both parties should take the opportunity to do their homework and come to an understanding about the effort, costs, and risks involved in developing that interface. Set expectations. Include in the EHR contract detail about the systems that the EHR system will need to integrate with and the cost of the integration work. Consider including an HL7 warranty. While HL7 is not, as I said before, a guarantee of interoperability, it will make interoperability easier if the EHR system uses HL7 standards. Finally, provide the EHR customer with appropriate remedies. Termination rights may be an appropriate remedy. The parties should consider whether the EHR customer should be able to terminate the EHR contract if the EHR system vendor isn't able to successfully interface the EHR with, for example, the customer's lab system. A practical termination remedy should address the transition issues involved in switching EHR systems, and the most important of those issues is data transfer. With respect to cloud-based EHR systems in particular, the EHR contract should at least provide a framework for when and how the EHR vendor will provide the EHR customer with its records. Monetary remedies, damages, may be appropriate too. If the failure of an integration is due to the failure of the EHR system to meet specifications included in the contract, it's probably reasonable for the EHR system vendor to help defray the customer's cost of transitioning to a different EHR system or hiring a third party to develop the interface. On the other hand, I don't think that an EHR system vendor should be on the hook if an integration fails despite the EHR system operating within stated specifications and the interface working consistently with the other system's published interface standards. Now let's talk about system performance. My wife and I had a car that blew up. Well, not the whole car, the engine. Turns out the manufacturer kind of didn't put the camshafts together right, and that apparently is a bad thing. So when it blew up, the manufacturer provided me with a loaner and fixed the car at no cost to me. So what did I do? I sold the car immediately and bought a different make and model. Was that logical? No. That car essentially had a new engine, and the manufacturer had provided me with prompt and effective service. By selling it and buying a new car, I incurred significant unnecessary costs and ditched a manufacturer that had demonstrated good customer service. What's the moral of the story? We don't act rationally when we make a big investment in something that breaks. However, when you have the opportunity in the relative calm of EHR contract negotiations to address how the parties should handle EHR system performance issues, I suggest considering a broader set of concepts than just assigning blame and costs. An EHR contract should proactively address the steps that the parties should take to preserve patient safety and to seek and provide prompt and effective technical support. First, let's talk about patient safety issues. Not all system issues are created equal. To go back to our car analogy, for example, some issues can be handled by the dealer during your car's next oil change. Patient safety issues require emergency roadside assistance. For example, an EHR incorrectly rounds up patient's weight by 20 pounds with the result that a 35-pound child could be dosed medication in an amount suited for a 55-pound child with potentially life-threatening outcomes. How can you reach an appropriate compromise to best address patient safety issues? Share information. A prospective customer should understand on the front end how an EHR vendor handles issues that may affect patient safety. In particular, does the EHR vendor have a quality assurance program? A good quality assurance program can proactively identify an issue, inform customers of the issue, provide a workaround, and promptly implement a fix. Set up a process. A special notification process is helpful. If an EHR customer discovers what appears to be a patient safety issue, the customer should be able to raise the issue quickly with the EHR vendor with appropriate alarms. It's helpful for the EHR vendor and customer to each provide a single point of contact to deal with patient safety issues. If an EHR vendor discovers a patient safety issue, it should have a special notification process to warn its customers of the issue and to enable them to take appropriate precautions. Customers should identify in the EHR contract the appropriate contacts for handling these issues. Create a special notification process. Just like when you take your car to the mechanic to diagnose a strange noise, an issue must be reproducible and verifiable to be addressed. For issues identified by an EHR customer, the EHR customer should have an internal process for identifying and documenting safety issues, especially system issues, especially ones that may impact patient safety. The EHR customer should identify certain of its people to work with the EHR vendor to enable the EHR vendor to reproduce and diagnose the issue. Temporary workarounds may need to be implemented while the issue is being reviewed, including having the EHR customer simply stop using a particular functionality until the issue has been reproduced, diagnosed, and resolved. The EHR vendor should keep EHR customers updated as to the progress of issue resolution, including if the issue is diagnosed as being caused by an external source. Notification by the EHR vendor to the EHR customers of the cause so that the EHR customers can raise the issue with the external source. Now let's talk about regular service and support. Nothing made by man will continue to work without regular maintenance. Some things, like my 72 Buick LeSabre, require more maintenance than others. How can you reach an appropriate compromise to deal with service and support issues? Well, share information. Every EHR vendor, whether they offer an on-premises software product or a cloud-based system, should be able to provide prospective customers with information about the EHR vendor's service and support program. Prospective customers should ask the EHR vendor about the EHR system's recent service history. If a prospective customer is contemplating an EHR system switch because of a negative service history on the customer's current EHR system, the customer should consider providing information on the negative service issues to the new EHR vendor, subject to any confidentiality obligations that the customer may have under its current EHR contract. That information may enable the new EHR vendor to proactively address some service issues. Set expectations. Identify service response times in the EHR contract. A typical format for identifying service response times is a table or a grid that breaks down the nature and timing of the EHR provider's response by the severity of the service issue. In other words, critical issues should be addressed, well, really quickly. Issues that aren't critical should be handled on a reasonable time frame, and, well, nice to have customer requests may not ever be dealt with. The key terms that the parties should discuss and agree upon are who designates the severity of an issue. Typically, the EHR vendor wants to control severity designation in order to manage resource allocation. On the other hand, EHR customers suffering from a service issue usually want the issue addressed as soon as possible. After all, that's what they're paying for. Consider whether the response times adequately reflect the severity of the issues. This is a multi-layered issue that depends upon the definitions of each severity level, the nature of the responses required of the EHR vendor, and the timing of those responses. For cloud-based EHRs, identify the minimum required uptime. Of course, uptime is another loaded term that an EHR vendor and customer should unpack. What is up? Does up mean that all functionality of the EHR is available, or something less than that, like all functionality necessary to provide the EHR customer with most of the functionality? What isn't up? Yes, I know, if something's down, it ain't up. But most EHR contracts, as well as most contracts in general, include a little French name provision called force majeure that can turn down into up. The French, by the way, seem to enjoy causing confusion to English speakers. In the 1970s, they gave us the le car, which means the car in French. I think they did that so that they could smirk every time an English speaker like me puts the in front of le car, like I just did. The car. Yep, very funny. Of course, GM did the same thing with the LeSabre, but I don't credit GM with having a sense of humor or any personality whatsoever. Heck, GM can't even make an ignition switch that works. Force majeure provisions are intended to give a contracting party a break if that party can't perform because of something outside his reasonable control. We're talking about biblical stuff. Floods, tornadoes, things like that. But less majeure things have crept into force majeure provisions. Failure of subcontractors, failure of communication systems, power outages. It looks like legal boilerplate, but I recommend that EHR vendors and customers have a real conversation about force majeure. Is 99% uptime good? Well, probably not unless 7 hours of downtime a month works for you. And that's before you take into account downtime caused by scheduled maintenance, which, by the way, scheduled maintenance is a good thing. Scheduled maintenance, even when it requires downtime, helps make the system work. It's a good idea to have the EHR vendor and customer each identify a single point of contact, or if one person isn't workable, a limited number of contacts to handle service and support issues. That reduces the risk of an EHR vendor spinning its wheels. That's another car reference, just in case you were keeping score, on matters that the EHR customer may not actually care about, or that may actually be user training issues instead of technical issues. You also should make clear the difference between software updates and bug fixes on the one hand, which should be provided as part of regular maintenance, and upgrades and new releases, which are generally provided for an extra charge. Last, you should provide the EHR customer with appropriate remedies. In most cases, the EHR vendor and customer want the same thing, that the EHR works when and as expected. However, sometimes the EHR customer may feel the need to give the EHR vendor a little push to get an issue remedied. Service credits are a common remedy. I'm not a fan of them. Most EHR contracts require the customer to pay license and maintenance fees in advance, so service credits won't apply unless the customer renews the EHR contract. And that creates a strange incentive for the customer to renew a relationship that isn't working well. A better remedy, in my opinion, is escalation. Give the EHR customer the ability to raise an unresolved issue up the vendor's corporate ladder. Provide a process for escalation that includes names, titles, contact information. Escalating important unresolved issues to the vendor's executive suite can be helpful to both the vendor and the customer. The EHR vendor's Chief Technology Officer, for example, may be able to identify larger issues that support staff are too close to a particular aspect of the EHR system to see. Plus, providing an upset EHR customer with the opportunity to talk to the boss demonstrates to the customer that the EHR vendor values the customer. If all else fails, the EHR customer should have the ability to terminate without penalty. However, because termination is an extreme remedy, a termination remedy for service failures should have a trigger that's based on repeated, unresolved, and critical system failures. Training. In 1986, my dad tried to teach me how to drive and maintain the now infamous 1972 Buick LeSabre. He said something about stepping on the gas pedal like it was an egg and checking the oil every time I filled up the gas tank. I got a speeding ticket. Yes, I got a speeding ticket in the 72 Buick LeSabre shortly after I got my driver's license. And I'm pretty sure that the only reason I didn't burn up the engine from lack of oil was because 14 years worth of oil greased the inside of that engine. There's no moral here, I'm just sharing. The scope of training that an EHR customer needs an EHR vendor to provide depends upon the type of EHR system. More technical training is needed for on-premises EHR systems than for cloud-based EHR systems. And the roles that the EHR customer's personnel will have dictate the type of training they'll need. Drivers need less training than mechanics, although there's actually a very good argument that drivers need more training than they think they do. Here in Nashville, we use an informal system of polite hand waves and head nods instead of traffic rules to guide us through four-way stops. The key for both vendors and customers is for the parties to think through and agree upon what kind of training is needed. So, how do we reach a good compromise on training? First, we share information. Where a healthcare provider intends to implement an on-premises EHR system, the provider will likely need in-depth technical training for its IT personnel. The EHR customer should work with the EHR vendor to determine the appropriate training programs based on the proposed EHR implementation and the skills and experience of the EHR customer's IT personnel. Cloud-based EHR systems require less on-site support by the healthcare provider, but some level of frontline tech support will still need to be provided. It's likely that the training for provider IT personnel can be done through a combination of webinars, teleconferences, and short sessions at the provider's offices. Medical personnel will need user training whether the EHR system is on-premises or cloud-based. The EHR customer should give the EHR vendor background on the technical savvy of its medical personnel and prior computer training experiences, namely what worked and what didn't work. The trainer approach may work best. That's where an EHR vendor trains the customer's IT service personnel to use the EHR system and provides the customer's IT service personnel with the materials necessary to train the customer's medical personnel. Then we set expectations. The EHR contract should include clear descriptions of the training programs that the vendor and customer agree are appropriate, including prices, class sizes, the duration of the programs, and when they're offered. For on-premises EHR systems in particular, technical training is often done at the EHR vendor's facilities and may need to be scheduled months in advance. In that situation, the EHR contract should, if possible, reserve an appropriate number of seats at the appropriate technical training. The EHR vendor should inform the customer of any rescheduling charges and of implementation delays that could result from the failure of the EHR customer's technical personnel completing their training on schedule. Data privacy and security. I'm pretty impressed with myself for using a picture of a steering wheel club to extend the car analogy to data privacy and security. But then again, as my wife will tell you, I'm generally impressed with myself, and, well, without much reason to be. When talking about data privacy and security, it's important to be clear about the data that needs protecting. There's personal health information, which we all call PHI, and then there's the proprietary information of the EHR vendor and the EHR customer. PHI is the stuff regulated by HIPAA and state privacy laws. HIPAA is the thing that requires healthcare providers and their business associates to enter into business associate agreements to protect the privacy and security of PHI. On the other hand, the proprietary information of the EHR vendor and customer isn't regulated stuff. It's just the stuff that the EHR vendor and customer would like to keep confidential because at least some of the value of the proprietary information arises from the fact that it's at least kind of a secret. It's also important when talking about data privacy and security to keep in mind who has control over the data that needs protecting. On-premises EHR systems are, for the most part, under the control of the EHR customer or its off-site data center provider. Cloud-based EHR systems are under the control of the EHR vendor or its off-site data center provider, but that only means when the data is at rest. And when I say data at rest, I mean data sitting on a computer and not in transmission over the internet. Then there's email, mobile devices, and mobile computing. Those are all under the control of the NSA. Reaching a good compromise on data privacy and security, first and foremost, requires, well, sharing information. Share information about what proprietary information needs to be shared. You don't need a confidentiality provision in an EHR contract if the EHR vendor and customer won't be sharing proprietary information. Don't just assume you need a confidentiality provision. Remember, the business associate agreement will cover PHI. If you're a cloud-based EHR vendor, will you actually provide your customer with confidential information about your EHR system? Because of the nature of a cloud-based service, your customers won't have access to your source code. And if you post all of the user manuals and documentation about your EHR system on your public website, it ain't confidential. If you're an on-premises EHR vendor, you probably need a confidentiality provision in addition to the typical covenants against reverse engineering and copying to protect your code. If you're an EHR customer, tell the EHR vendor what kinds of proprietary information that you think the EHR vendor will have access to, and ask the EHR vendor if, in fact, it needs access to that information. For example, I don't expect it that an EHR vendor needs to have access to an EHR customer's proprietary financial information. For on-premises EHR systems, security and privacy issues are mostly in the hands of the EHR customer, but the EHR vendor should provide information about design features that could pose security risks. For example, the EHR system may have backdoors used to give the EHR vendor remote access to provide support services. The EHR vendor should understand whether there are backdoors, and if so, what purposes they serve, and how the EHR vendor regulates access to them. The EHR vendor should provide the EHR customer with information about the EHR vendor's security policies. This is especially important for cloud-based EHR systems. Finally, you need to set expectations. The Business Associate Agreement covers PHI and should meet HIPAA and state law requirements. I know that many healthcare providers expand business associate agreements to include a variety of other terms. I've even seen employee non-solicitation provisions stuck into business associate agreements. But my personal preference is to limit the business associate agreement to the statutorily required terms. The place for the negotiated business terms, in my opinion, is the EHR contract. If the parties will actually share proprietary information, then include an appropriately narrow confidentiality provision covering that proprietary information in the EHR agreement. Don't let your lawyers off the hook by allowing them to include a broad, catch-all confidential provision. Make them earn their fees. Include in the EHR contract protocols for service-related remote access. You could even consider requiring that the EHR customer authorize remote access backdoors to be opened each time, although I have to say that may adversely impact or at least delay the EHR vendor's ability to provide support services. We're on to the last topic, protection from IP infringement, which is good because now you can enjoy seeing a photo of my dog. Her name's Francesca. She's a Bichon Frise, which I think is French for little white dog who can poop on the floor without getting in trouble because my wife thinks she's so cute. Look it up on Wikipedia if you don't believe me. So you're probably asking yourselves, what does Francesca the Bichon Frise have to do with EHRs, or cars for that matter? I think that's an excellent question. Let's move on. Intellectual property infringement. That's lawyer speak for using someone else's stuff without permission. It's stealing, but instead of stealing cars or Bichon Frise bandanas, someone's stealing esoteric things like code and business processes. IP infringement claims involving EHR systems would most likely arise from the EHR software itself, for example, a copyright infringement claim, the use of the EHR system in combination with other technologies, for example, a patent infringement claim alleging infringement of a business process, and unauthorized use of the EHR system. For example, an EHR customer uses the EHR system as a social networking platform that infringes Facebook's patents. That's kind of a stretch, but work with me. The risks arising from IP infringement claims are liability for damages and litigation costs, reduction of functionality of the EHR system to eliminate infringing functionalities, and unexpected termination of the EHR contract, which means that the EHR vendor can't make money and the EHR customer suddenly doesn't have an EHR system. When you hear those risks, whether you're an EHR vendor or an EHR customer, you think to yourself, that dog don't hunt. And in the case of Francesca the Bichon Frise, you couldn't be more right. How do we reach a good compromise to best protect each other from IP infringement issues? Stop me if you've heard this before, but the first step is to share information. What's the EHR vendor's recent history of infringement claims? What third-party software, especially open source software, will be used in connection with the EHR system? Other people's software brings additional risks of infringement claims, and open source software in particular doesn't come with any protections against infringement claims. Then set expectations. Identify in the EHR contract the additional software or systems to be used in combination with the EHR system. Identify any customizations to the EHR system that are expected to be made. Finally, allocate each party's risk with an intellectual property infringement indemnification provision. I'll throw you a bone. Well, that's actually a double pun on Francesca the Bichon Frise and the name of my law firm. And I won't go into the intricacies of an IP infringement indemnity. Suffice to say that the idea of the indemnity is to require the EHR vendor to protect the EHR customer from third-party infringement claims that the EHR vendor could reasonably foresee based on the licensed use of the EHR system. Boy, I am dog tired. I'll put this presentation in park and turn it over to Lori for questions. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, Steve. Now we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. As a reminder, please use the questions section on the GoToWebinar panel to submit your questions to Steve. The first one is, can you discuss hold harmless clauses and non-disclosure clauses?
Hold harmless clauses and non-disclosure clauses. They're two different things that aren't necessarily related. Hold harmless typically refers to an indemnification, and the concept behind that is one party shouldn't be responsible for liabilities, third-party claims that are caused by the behavior, the acts or omissions of the other party. So the typical example in the EHR context would be the EHR vendor should be held harmless, and this is an arguable point, from medical malpractice claims. In the context, and the idea behind that would be the physician providing the care is the one responsible for ensuring that the medical care meets appropriate standards of patient care. If the physician provides a subpar level of care, you could argue that a third-party claim, a claim brought by the patient who is subjected to the medical malpractice against the EHR system vendor, is not a liability that the EHR system vendor should bear, and so that the healthcare provider should hold the EHR system vendor harmless from that kind of claim. That's an example, and that's one that I know is a tough one for healthcare providers. They don't necessarily care for that, but that's a good example of a hold harmless provision in this context. The other topic, the other question was about confidentiality and non-disclosure provisions. Again, we kind of talked about that. The idea behind those is simply to, when we're not talking about patient information and we're talking about each other's proprietary information, it's to the extent that you're disclosing, one party is disclosing to the other party, for lack of a better word, secret and proprietary information, they want to make sure that the other party treats it and holds it confidential, so that there's no loss of value in that information, which part of the value is derived from it being kept confidential. I hope I answered that correctly, or at least somewhat.
I think you'll like this next question. I need to make a referral for a client. Are you accepting new clients at this time? Wait, it's a two-part question. And also, where can I get a Bichon Frise?
The second part is you have to find a female and a male Bichon Frise. And beyond that, I don't think I want to go into how you get them to get you another Bichon Frise. As far as referrals, yes, I'm always willing to take referrals. I like business. That's how I earn money.
That's what I thought you would say. Can you talk about how you advise an EHR contracting and how that would be different for a solo practice or a very small, like 5 doctors or less practice? Are there any different or especially dangerous pitfalls to watch out for?
I think the biggest pitfall for small practices is the lack of time that they have to focus on the front end. There's a tremendous incentive because healthcare providers are very busy to basically say, to listen to a friend and say, well, they've had good luck with a particular EHR system, or for that matter, any particular kind of software that's used in medical practices, and just to assume, well, based on their recommendation, or maybe even the somewhat broader recommendation, that's what we'll go with, and you sign up. There still has to be some individualized due diligence, some front-end discussion with the EHR vendor to see how the system will work, not only by itself, but also with the other systems that the medical practice has. Again, driving it back to the car analogy, you would not buy a car sight unseen, or at least most people wouldn't, which is why a lot of in the car world, automotive websites that try to sell cars online don't work very well. Automotive websites that advertise for dealers cars for sale do work because it just drives people to the dealership to see, test, and learn about the cars. That's my approach on the EHR contracts. You need to, and EHR systems, no matter what the size of the practice, you need to spend the time on the front end to learn about what it is you intend to buy and how it will work for your purposes and with your systems.
Okay, the next question ties in really nicely with all that talk about the cars. This person wants to know, how fast were you going in the 72 Buick when you got a ticket, and how long did it take you to get the Buick moving that fast?
Not very fast, and a very long time.
Okay, this looks like the last question. You've talked a lot about reaching good compromises. That's a nice world you've envisioned, but we're here on Earth with giant healthcare companies, giant insurance companies, giant EHR companies, and the government, none of whom are at all interested in reaching compromises. Does your advice have any real-world application?
First, ouch, that's kind of a biting comment, but I think it's perfectly legitimate. The premise of that question is that someone with the power to say no, whether the power comes from market share, economics, or government regulation, will say no. The question assumes that contract negotiations are a binary process where there's a winner and a loser on every issue. The parties to an EHR contract actually have a shared goal. They both want the EHR system to meet the EHR customer's expectations. The key is to share information and set expectations on the front end so that the customer's expectations match what the EHR vendor can deliver. Once the parties reach a shared understanding of how the EHR system will perform, they should both push their lawyers to revise the EHR contract, if that's necessary, to reflect that shared understanding. At that point, it's not a question of leverage. It's a question of memorializing or documenting the understanding of the parties.
We've actually got a couple more, Steve, if you have a minute. Do you
Sure.
have any thoughts or guidance on including a meaningful use warranty in EHR contracts?
My thought is, I've seen them. I don't think they accomplish much. If the EHR vendor gives you one and gives you one with appropriate legal advice, it's going to be more of a warranty that they've received certification that the EHR can be used to achieve meaningful use. The big problem with meaningful use certifications or reps or warranties is that a lot of the burden is actually on the healthcare provider to do the things that, to use the EHR and all the functionality of it that's provided. So, you know, bad analogy, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make it drink. That's the issue for the EHR vendor. So possibly there's some value in a limited certification or acknowledgement by the EHR vendor that that the particular EHR system is ONC certified, but that's about it. Otherwise, it's not something that's singularly in the hands of either party. It's a combination of things that achieve meaningful use.
Okay, this has to be the last one. We're working towards signing a contract with an HCCN that will host our EMR. Do we need to see the contract between the EMR vendor and the HCCN, or should we just concentrate on the contract with the HCCN? And are there any particular issues with this type of situation?
You know, it's one I have not dealt with. If you're not a contracting party, then you may not be able to see the terms of the contract. So the the two entities that are contracting, the electronic health record vendor and the other party, are probably the two that can see the terms of that contract. Beyond that, it's really more specifics. I just haven't dealt with that. My recommendation is to focus on the terms of the contract that the practice has, and not necessarily worry about the obligations between the other two parties. It's one of those things. If you're going in an indirect contracting route, you end up not necessarily knowing what the terms are of the other relationship. Not a whole lot of help on that. I just haven't had to deal with that particular issue before.
Okay, thanks, Steve. That was our last question, and so it's time to conclude our webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Steve, for a fun, despite your disclaimer, and informative presentation. Attendees should watch your email for links to today's recording as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. We look forward to seeing you at our next HIS webinar, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the day.